When I entered the kitchen, my heart started racing upon seeing the scene in front of me. I no longer had the strength to endure my husband's aggressive behavior. Right in front of me, he was making banana juice. As soon as his eyes met mine, he smiled mysteriously. Seeing him smile made me feel an intense sense that something was wrong. Just a week ago, he had done the same thing, and after that, it had become a routine. Whenever we were about to have sex, he would drink this juice, which gave him the strength of 5 men. However, during that time, I would feel completely broken, and I couldn't bear it anymore. He gestured for me to come over. I had planned to run away, but his gesture made me nervous. I quickly shook my head in denial, but he got angry. Reluctantly, I walked over to him. During this, I kept looking around because I was still newly married and didn't trust my husband at all. Sometimes he didn't even care that we weren't alone. He would do things in front of others that would embarrass me to no end, while he didn't seem affected at all. It seemed like he had no concept of shame. As soon as I reached him, he grabbed my arm and jerked me towards him. I lost my balance, and my hand struck the jug, causing it to fall and shatter on the floor. At first, his mouth hung open in surprise, while I secretly felt a sense of relief inside. I was happy the jug had broken because I wasn't sure if I could handle what was about to happen after drinking that juice. In a way, it was good that the jug fell and broke. While I secretly felt happy, my husband stared at the spilled juice on the floor with longing eyes. I glanced outside at the weather. It was terrible. The rain had been falling since the morning, and since it was winter rain, stepping outside meant risking getting sick. My husband was extremely careful about his health and believed that if he fell ill, he wouldn't be able to keep me happy. I, on the other hand, just wanted to find a way to escape from him for a few days because his behavior had become unbearable. It had been 2 weeks since our marriage, and in these 2 weeks, there wasn't a single night when my husband didn't drink that juice. When he had first drunk it, I had made fun of him, thinking that nothing would happen and that it was just some bookish nonsense. But when I saw his power, I became terrified, and I even had to beg him. Even now, when he saw the broken jug, he glared at me in anger and asked, "Who's responsible for this?" I quickly lowered my head and a smile spread across my face. I tried my best to hide my smile, knowing that if he saw me smiling, I would be in serious trouble. For a few moments, Arslan stared at me like that, and then quickly stormed out of the house. When I saw him leave, I became worried and asked, "Where are you going?" He told me that they had run out of bananas at home, so he was going out to get some. His answer raised suspicions about his mental state. The rain was coming down heavily outside, and he was going out in this weather just to buy bananas. Along with that, I started to worry about myself. I knew that tonight my torment was about to begin again. I didn't know what to do. I sat back down on the same chair and buried my head in my hands. After a little while, my sister-in-law came to me and said, "Why are you sitting here so troubled? You've just gotten married. You should be happy." I looked at her face dismissively. How could I explain to her that I hadn't had a single peaceful night to myself? Even during the day, I couldn't rest because of all the household chores. These things I kept to myself. She sat with me for a while, making small talk, but I wasn't paying attention to her. My mind was tangled in thoughts about my husband. A little while later, he entered the house, drenched from the rain. His condition looked bad. My sister-in-law asked him, "Why did you go out in this rain?" He showed her the bag of bananas he had gone out to get, as if it was completely normal. His sister teased him, saying, "You went through all that trouble just to get bananas? And was it just for the bananas, or did Bobby ask for them?" When I heard my sister-in-law's words, I lowered my head into my hands. I felt like I could die right there, but today, I couldn't make that request. I was exhausted, and more than anything, I wanted to rest and get a full night's sleep. But seeing my husband's behavior made me feel that even this simple wish would remain unfulfilled. Arslan turned to me and said, "Quickly make my juice. I'll take care of the rest." I nodded quickly in response, and without another word, he went back outside. Now I was confused. Why was he going out again? After a little while, I called his number, but it was switched off. About an hour later, he came back, but he wasn't alone. His aunt had come with him. She had recently arrived in the city, but hadn't had a chance to meet us until now. So he had brought her along so she could meet me and spend some time with us. After meeting his aunt, I went to the kitchen and started making tea for them. Meanwhile, my husband came in to help. I watched him and thought to myself that, although he was 55 years old, he certainly didn't look it. Looking at his energy, no one could guess he was over 50. The vitality he had was incredible. No one would ever guess that a 55-year-old man could do all this. Another thing that always baffled me was that no one ever called him Baha'i, brother. Instead, everyone just called him by his name. Hearing his voice brought me back to the present. He said to me, "Don't look at me like that. Don't make me drink the juice right now. Save those sweet looks for tonight, when I'll really need them." He came close, whispering in my ear, "Tonight, I don't want to hear any excuses like I'm tired or I'm not feeling well." With that, he quickly left the kitchen. I took deep breaths. Just thinking about what was to come tonight made my body feel sick again. I prayed, hoping somehow to avoid it. But I knew that fate had already been written. No prayer or plea could change it. It was about 7 p.m. when suddenly my mother-in-law said, "Quickly set the table. We're eating now." Hearing this, I became anxious. The urgency of setting the table meant we would soon have to go to our room, and going to our room quickly meant my thoughts were interrupted as I buried my head in my hands. Seeing my condition, my mother-in-law asked, "What happened, dear? Do you have a headache?" Hearing this, I quickly shook my head in denial and forced a smile. I scolded myself, telling myself not to let the condition of my heart show on my face. Earlier in the day, my sister-in-law had asked me the same question, and now my mother-in-law was asking me the same thing. I controlled myself and did my best to ensure that my face didn't betray my worries. Even during dinner, my husband kept looking at me with loving eyes. His gaze made it hard for me to swallow my food. Yes, it had been 2 weeks since our marriage, but every time the nightfall approached, my conditions started to deteriorate. Meanwhile, he kept smiling at me, watching me struggle. Before our marriage, I had protested strongly, creating quite a scene, saying that I wouldn't marry a 55-year-old man. I couldn't spend my entire life with someone just because of their wealth. There were other essential things for a woman, one of which was her rights. Rights that a man must fulfill. And men must ensure they fulfill these duties at all costs. When I heard my husband was 55, I thought, how will he fulfill my rights? But the day I married him and the next day when I saw him drink that juice, I realized I was wrong. My husband was powerful even without that juice. And when he drank that juice, it became almost unbearable. A few days ago, I was talking to a friend, and jokingly, she teased me saying, "Your life must be really difficult. Your husband doesn't seem to fulfill any of your needs, does he?" At first, I became angry, but when I explained my husband's situation to her, her jaw dropped in disbelief. She asked, "Are you joking with me?" I quickly shook my head and told her, "I'm not joking, and I'm not lying to you. I'm telling you the truth." For a moment, she couldn't say anything. Then in a hurry, she asked, "Tell me the recipe for the juice you make for your husband." Hearing this, I laughed. I realized that the allegations she had made about my husband were in fact true for her own husband. I smiled and wrote down the recipe for her. The next day, she called me and said, "I made a huge mistake giving that juice to my husband. It really worked, and now I've gotten myself into the same trouble you're in." As the night passed, my fear only grew. It was nearly 10 p.m. and everyone was still sitting around chatting. Since my husband's aunt was visiting, my mother-in-law had suggested that we stay up late, talking and spending time with her. I was silently thankful that I had managed to stay away from my husband for the time being. An hour passed as everyone continued talking. By now, my husband's aunt was feeling sleepy and suggested we end the gathering. Hearing this, I nervously glanced at my husband, who was smiling at me. A little while later, I went to my room, and I was shocked by what I saw. The room was beautifully decorated, with red roses scattered everywhere. I didn't even realize when my husband had decorated the room. When I asked him, he lovingly pinched my cheek and said, "While my dear wife was working in the kitchen, I did this decoration for you." Hearing this, my heart started racing. He told me, "Now quickly go to the kitchen and bring me my juice." I sat back down on the bed and said, "I don't have the strength to get up. You should go and bring the juice yourself." At first, he stared at me angrily, but then, with a smile, he left the room. I lay there on the bed, thinking that tonight, once again, I was going to have to endure something terrible. I had been lying there for about 15 minutes, but my husband still hadn't returned to the room. I was surprised because usually, whenever he went out, he would come back in just a couple of minutes. I sat up in bed, looking toward the door. Another 15 minutes passed, and I was starting to lose my patience. I had mentally prepared myself, but the delay was starting to make me angry. Before I could go to the lounge, I suddenly heard someone screaming. Hearing the shouts, I became anxious. When I went to the lounge, I found my husband shouting and asking everyone in the house, who took the juice that I had kept for myself? My mother-in-law quickly stepped forward, placed her hand on my husband's shoulder, and said, "Oh dear, what's going on? Why are you so angry? It was just a glass of juice." Hearing his mother's words, he shook his head violently in denial and said, "For you, it might be just a glass of juice, but for me, it was everything. Tell me, who took that juice and who took the jug from the kitchen cupboard?" Everyone stood silently, not having the courage to speak. Upon hearing my husband's yelling, my aunt quickly came out and asked, "What's going on? Why all the noise?" Looking at my aunt, my husband realized his mistake. He had forgotten that there were guests in the house. He had become so wild that he hadn't even paid attention to my aunt. On the other hand, seeing my husband in this state made me worried, and I felt like tonight my death was inevitable. Seeing my aunt, my husband quickly lowered his head and started apologizing. "It's nothing, Aunt. It's just that these people have messed with my mind." My aunt asked him, "Please tell me, what's going on? Why are you so upset over something gone missing?" My husband explained, "I had kept a glass of juice in the fridge, the one I drink before bed every night. It's something I've become used to. If I don't drink it, I can't sleep. But today, when I went to get it, it was gone. I don't know who took it." When my aunt heard this, she quickly slapped her forehead and said, "Oh dear, you should have told me about it earlier. I didn't know that it was your juice." My husband and I drank a little of it. You know how much I love tasting new things? Upon hearing my aunt's words, I started coughing. It wouldn't have been much of a problem if only they had drunk the juice. But now my aunt had also given some to her husband. The image of my aunt's tearful face suddenly flashed before my eyes. I lowered my head so that the rest of the family wouldn't see me laughing. My husband, too, went completely silent and said, "All right, Aunt, it's fine, but just be careful with what you do tonight." Hearing his words, I burst out laughing uncontrollably. Seeing me laugh like that, the family was confused and asked, "What have you two been up to? Tell us, what's so funny that you're both laughing this much?" I quickly apologized and went back to my room. A little while later, my husband returned to the room. I knew that he didn't really need the juice. Even without it, he was more powerful than 3 or 4 men combined. He came close and took my hand, saying, "I apologize that today I'll have to come near you without the juice." I lowered my head. Before he could say anything more, suddenly there was a knock on the door. The sound of the knock made me feel intense disgust. I could barely hold myself back from throwing everyone out who was coming to disturb us over and over again. This time it was my sister-in-law. As soon as she came close, she said, "Aunt is feeling really sick. We have to take her to the hospital right now." I instinctively looked at my husband, who was staring at me. He sighed deeply and told me to stay in the room. He quickly went out, and he spent the entire night at the hospital while I managed to get a full night's sleep. The next morning when I woke up, I felt incredibly refreshed. The wish I had been longing for was finally fulfilled. A little while later, my husband came into the room. I greeted him with a smile. Seeing my smile, he became irritated and said, "Your husband spent the entire night at the hospital, and you're still smiling. How can you be so unaffected by all of this?" This time, I struggled to stop my smile from showing. While speaking, he looked like an innocent child. I quickly grabbed my ears and told him, "I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Please forgive me. I won't do it again." He smiled and then, holding my hand, said, "Last night I couldn't spend time with you, but I promise tonight I'll make sure you don't have any complaints." Hearing his words, I smiled too, because I had already gotten my sleep and I was feeling much better now. My irritability had faded, so I was eagerly waiting for the night to come. But time seemed to crawl by slowly. During the day, I was in the kitchen making food when suddenly I got a call from my house. My mother was urgently asking me to come home because my brother was returning from Saudi Arabia. When I told my husband about my mother's call, he said, "Tell your sisters that if they have bananas and chickpeas at home, then I'll bring you along. Otherwise, forget about it. You're not going anywhere." Hearing my husband's words, I burst into laughter. I was still on the phone when he said this. I could hear the frustration in his voice, but I couldn't help but laugh at how ridiculous his condition was. I quickly hung up and looked at him. "Why do you insist on these silly conditions?" I asked, still giggling. He just looked at me seriously, his lips barely curving into a smile. "You don't understand," he said. "Bananas and chickpeas are an absolute must. You can't go without them." It was his typical way of asserting control, but I found it more amusing than anything else. After all, he wasn't wrong. His strange rules often had a certain logic that only he could understand. As the day progressed, my thoughts were preoccupied with my brother's return. I hadn't seen him in months, and I was looking forward to spending time with him. But my husband's strange demands had me slightly frustrated. He had always been possessive, especially when it came to social gatherings. He liked having me close, and any disruption to that routine would often make him uneasy. I tried to push these thoughts aside and focus on preparing for my brother's arrival. Later that afternoon, my sister-in-law came over to discuss the upcoming family gathering. She mentioned how excited everyone was for my brother's return and that the whole family was planning to celebrate together. However, I could sense that there was some tension in the air. My husband wasn't too keen on having a large gathering. His attitude towards social events had always been strange. While he loved having people over, he preferred having complete control over the situation. He would often make unexpected demands that left everyone feeling slightly uncomfortable, myself included. As the evening approached, I found myself feeling torn. On one hand, I was excited to see my brother again and to catch up with everyone. On the other hand, my husband's behavior was making it harder for me to enjoy these moments fully. I couldn't help but think about the growing distance between us. I was beginning to feel trapped, caught between my own desires and his overwhelming need to control every aspect of my life. That night, when I finally got dressed to leave, my husband stood in front of me, blocking the door. "You're not going anywhere until I get my juice," he said sternly. It was the same routine. I rolled my eyes, trying to suppress my frustration. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered. But I knew he wasn't joking. This was part of the control he had over me, always making sure that I complied with his wishes, even when they seemed trivial or unnecessary. Before I could protest any further, my phone rang. It was my mother again. "Where are you? Your brother's waiting, and we're all getting ready for dinner," she urged. I quickly apologized and reassured her that I would be there soon. As I hung up, I looked at my husband, who still hadn't moved. "Can you please let me go? It's important," I pleaded. He hesitated for a moment, but then stepped aside. "All right," he muttered, "but don't forget the juice." I left the room in a hurry, my heart heavy with a sense of impending dread. I knew I couldn't avoid the inevitable. The way things were going, it seemed like I was forever caught in this cycle. I would never be free from these demands, these strange rules that he insisted on, and yet I still felt tied to him in a way that I couldn't escape. My mind raced as I walked down the hall. There was no easy solution, no way out that didn't involve making sacrifices I wasn't willing to make. When I arrived at my mother's house, the warmth of the family's embrace was comforting, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in a world where nothing was ever truly my own. The small freedoms I had were always conditional, always tied to someone else's needs. I didn't know how much longer I could keep up with this charade, but for tonight at least, I would enjoy the brief respite of being with family. Tomorrow I knew would bring more struggles, more battles to fight. My sister eagerly asked me, "What's this deal with bananas and chickpeas?" Hearing her, I reassured her and said, "Don't worry, I'll tell you all about it soon, but when you find out, you'll be so shocked that you'll cover your ears and never bring it up again." She was becoming extremely impatient. The truth was, she had also recently gotten married, and I had decided that the next day, I would tell all the girls in my family about this. That way, if any of them had issues with their husbands, they could put an end to them. When I told my husband about it, he laughed heartily and said, "Soon enough, They'll start cursing you for giving them this remedy. They'll wonder why you ever told them about it. I replied, I don't care about that. I'm going to tell everyone about this remedy. We continued talking as we entered my mother's house. She was sitting in front and greeted me warmly with great enthusiasm. In the evening, we had arranged a gathering with all the family members because my brother was coming back after 4 years. During this time, my mind was filled with many tasks that I was quickly trying to take care of. But by night, I was feeling quite exhausted, and I didn't have the strength to do anything. My husband kept glancing at me repeatedly, and I understood the meaning behind his looks. I didn't want to refuse him tonight. When I entered the room at night, he grabbed my hand and comforted me, saying, "Don't worry, today's the last day. My 15-day treatment will be over, and after these 15 days, I'm sure I'll be completely healthy. After that, I'll be capable of becoming a father." The truth was, my husband had been suffering from a condition that temporarily made him infertile. This juice was specifically meant to cure that condition. A traditional healer had recommended this juice to him, which was highly effective. Thankfully, my husband had now fully recovered. Soon enough, I found out that I was going to be a mother. Now my husband was very happy and took extra care of me. The doctor had said that along with a healthy diet, I needed to get plenty of rest so that the baby would be healthy. My husband was now paying attention to my sleep, ensuring I was comfortable, and I was overjoyed and content. Despite the challenges, there was always ease after difficulty.